I'm going to read from Mark chapter 8. Mark chapter 8, beginning at verse 31 through to verse 38. One of my favourite passages in the Bible. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Then he called the crowd to him along with the disciples and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels."
Years ago, I remember seeing a device advertised that fitted onto the neck of a guitar. It was a contraption where the player could push just a couple of buttons to play chords. The device removed the need for stretching of the hand and getting sore fingers from pushing down on the strings. The idea was that somebody could learn to play the guitar without any particular hard work. And people like that sort of idea, don't they? Learning to play an instrument without all the practice, all the slog. Something similar came into my YouTube feed a couple of weeks ago. The video suggested that there were some exercises that I could do for just 5 minutes a day that would have all the benefits of working out hard for an hour. Well, that's appealing, isn't it? Be fit without all the effort of training. And still others want to gain academic achievement without any study and any revision. There were allegations a couple of weeks ago that a world leader had allegedly paid someone to sit exams for him. The story suggested that the exams were passed and this future politician, how shall I put it, came up trumps without having to do all the work. That's just alleged. I have no proof and I wouldn't want to stand by that. But we all know that in life the pattern is normally that there is a cost, a commitment involved in doing something, a genuine musical ability, actual physical fitness, real academic achievement. Well, none of them come about from quick fix methods without effort. And the Christian life doesn't work in that way either, if I can put it that way. Maybe I want all that Jesus offers the Christian: forgiveness, acceptance by God, eternal life, yes, especially eternal life. But maybe I want all these things whilst sitting back and doing very little. Sitting back and without putting Jesus first, without having any of the cost of putting Jesus first and putting before everything else in this life. But look what Jesus says in our passage, Mark 8, verse 34. Jesus called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, "If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." Following Jesus involves denying self and taking up our cross. And it's clear that this is for everyone. This verse knocks on the head the idea there's two types of Christians. Firstly, the committed ones, the keen ones, and then just the regular ones. Note verse 34, Jesus is speaking to the crowd and his disciples and says anyone. Therefore, what he's saying here is for all. This is the way to follow Jesus, the only way, the one way to follow Jesus. And as somebody once put it, the Christian life is a cross-shaped life. Now, this is no surprise after the section we looked at last week. Last week, if you remember, we read that Jesus said he must go to the cross. Not surprisingly, following Jesus means there be echoes of Jesus' life in our lives. Now, let's remember verse 31 from last week. It read, Jesus then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. Jesus said he must suffer, that he must be rejected, he must be killed, because that was the only way of salvation for those who would turn to him. Yes, of course this is the case, because we can't do anything to make ourselves right with God. Now, it is so important to remember at this point the teaching that's just gone before. Otherwise, when we read verse 34, we might think that if we live a certain kind of life and give up certain things, that might in some way win us eternal life. No, Jesus has said beforehand that it is his death that saves us. There's no salvation apart from through him and what he does. And having established that, there are then two things that Jesus points out that mark out the true follower of Jesus. Number one, deny self. And number two, take up your cross. First, to deny self. Well, why? Because putting self first is what puts us in trouble in the first place. Putting myself first above God separates me from him. It doesn't help with relationships with other people either when I put myself first. But as Jesus was saying in verse 31, Jesus died that I might be forgiven for this. And having received forgiveness, having been given a fresh start with God, surely the Christian will want to turn away from what caused the problems in the first place. So, deny self. And the second thing that Jesus points out is to take up our cross. This is a call to, if I can put it this way, put to death the things of our old life. Of course, remember in those days, carrying a cross, well, somebody doing that was on their way to die. These days, that phrase about carrying our cross, having a cross to bear, has been played down. So if somebody has an irritating boss or a tricky journey to work, someone will say, well, we all have our crosses to bear. But when Jesus used this phrase, he knew he would soon be on his way to his death on a cross. Remember, as Jesus was led out to die, he had to carry the heavy wooden crossbeam that he was to be executed upon. Jesus had to take up his cross, and he did it for others, for people like me, for every believer down the centuries. To follow Jesus is to lay down our desires to do things our own way and not do things Jesus' way. To take up our cross is to die to the right to make decisions based just on what we want instead of thinking, what does King Jesus want for me? In all of this, let's again remember the order of the passage. In verse 31 last week, Jesus dies for his people to give them eternal life. They then follow him, denying self. Jesus is calling his followers to live in response to what he's done for them, what he's done for us already. It reminds us we follow a caring, a loving Lord, one who laid down his very life for us. But the question is, as we read, particularly verse 34, we need to ask is that how we're living? Is following Jesus for me about how I fit him into everything else I want to do? Or am I responding to Jesus in the light of what he says in verse 34, denying ourselves, taking up our cross, following him? Well, how is this going to work out? Yes, in the big ways. Yes, in the really big decisions in life. This is about the whole direction of our lives. So for those just about to go off to university or already there, well, it's to live for Christ as soon as you arrive on campus, as soon as you meet with the other students. For others in the congregation, meeting more with people face to face than they have done for a while. It means praying that others would know that we're standing for Christ, that we're living for him. But if we've truly got this, then it won't be just in the big decisions of life, but in the smaller things as well. Everything we do at home, at work, in the garden, at school. For parents, when they chat with others at the school gate. It will work out in how we post things on social media, our reaction in that way. And so verse 34 sums up what it is to follow Jesus. Now, why? Why follow like this? It all sounds so huge. Well, at least no one can say that Jesus is hiding what it means to live for him in the small print. You may well have seen over the years the advert that Ernest Shackleton apparently put in some newspapers when he wanted fellow travellers to go with him on a dangerous polar expedition. The advert said this: men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honour and recognition in the case of success. Well, that's an advert that tells it as it is. But Jesus does something similar. But more than that, Jesus then gives 4 reasons for why living for him, even with the cost, is the most sensible option ever. And here's the first of the reasons. You lose your life for Christ to save it. Verse 35. Jesus says, for whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me and for the gospel will save it. So reason 1 from Jesus, trying to save your life for yourself now means you will ultimately lose it. But if you lose your life for Christ, you will save your life for eternity. Yes, this is about eternal life. And of course, we need to get that in place first of all. And now, although this is about eternity, there's a degree to which this works in the world now. The world we live in echoes something of our Creator. So even in this world, if we lose ourselves or give ourselves to others, then we know what it is to gain. So we'll all know that we've had the opportunity sometimes to help others, a busy time, sorting somebody out, helping somebody, and then we get a real sense of achievement, well-being, having helped and served other people. And so often that's much more satisfying than just having a day when we've just done what we wanted. And we understand the principle at Christmas, don't we? We know what it is to give something to somebody else and have the thrill of seeing them enjoy what we've given them. And you can probably think of all sorts of other examples in life generally. But what Jesus is speaking about, as I said earlier, is particularly about eternal life. And remember what Jesus is saying. He's talking about wanting us to follow him to have the best life. And it is Jesus, the one who gives us his life so that we might have eternal life, who's saying these things. He says it with love. Now, the second reason Jesus gives for living this way is, well, gaining everything now will mean that we will lose it in the end. Verse 36, Jesus says, what good is it for a man to gain the whole world yet forfeit his soul? What if you could gain everything in the world? What if you could be number 1 in the Sunday Times rich list, having more money than Elon Musk, having more dollar bills than Bill Gates, having more power than Putin? Now, would that be ultimately worth it? At the end of the day, would it be worth it? Just imagine you've gained the best qualifications from the best universities. Imagine you have the best job with the best satisfaction, with the largest pay. Imagine you have the best pension plan, the best retirement package. Imagine you're able to put on the best parties ever after lockdown when people can do that. Imagine you have the best and most lavish funeral. What would be the point of those things if you've enjoyed them all now for 100 years, but then you had nothing at all for eternity? Just imagine you then, for the next, not 100, but 100,000 years, you'd lost everything for eternity. See, Jesus is giving us a sense of proportion, a sense of the future. And he says this for our good, out of love for us. But desperately, many people don't see this. But what is the point of having everything now, but nothing for eternity? Jesus has to remind us of these things because it's so easy to be sucked into the things of this world and to follow the ideas of those around us who are only living for the here and now. And then there's a third reason that Jesus says for why we should follow as he calls. It's this. It is bartering with God, doing a deal with God just won't cut it. See verse 37. Jesus said, what can a person give in exchange for their soul? Jesus, in effect, takes us to the moment we stand before God. At that moment, what can we give in exchange for our soul? Now, just imagine that day you're standing before God, having put everything in your life, everything just into a good education, or everything just into comfortable living, just everything in having the up-to-date tech that's available. Verse 37, what could we use with anything that we have to do a deal with God? We couldn't do anything. And nothing can be exchanged for our souls. Therefore, if this life is all there is, then it's clear to get stuff, do stuff is the best option. But if there is eternity ahead, which Jesus speaks so clearly about, then it's either an eternity with God or an eternity away from God. And then the whole perspective is very different, isn't it? Of course, then, well, knowing that I want to follow Jesus, I want to be with him, verse 34, denying self, taking up our cross, following Jesus is the wisest thing to do. And then in verse 38, there's a final warning from Jesus. If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels. The point is, be ashamed of Jesus now and you'll miss out at the end of time. And make no mistake, living for Jesus now will cost. Living for Jesus now, holding on to his words is, well, I was going to say countercultural, but it goes beyond that now. Living for Jesus, standing for his words now, is often just downright unacceptable to people. So much of what Jesus says is not popular. Standing up for his words will be costly. Standing up for Jesus will be costly. So we can be very tempted to be ashamed of Jesus and what he says, what he teaches. We can be ashamed at work, at university, at school, sports clubs. People can be just tempted not to say anything about our Christian faith and what Jesus teaches. It can happen with friends and family. We can be tempted to be ashamed of what Jesus says and stands for. But here in verse 38, there's a specific application that we see from what we looked at last week. Remember last week, Jesus had said he must die, but Peter was ashamed of those words, verse 32. Peter was ashamed of what Jesus was saying. Peter was ashamed of a suffering Christ. And here we have the direct and probably the primary application to us. Are we ashamed of Jesus being the suffering and dying Christ who is the only way of salvation? So verse 38, if anyone, says Jesus, is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him or her when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels. If we deny, if we speak against the death of Jesus Christ as the only way of salvation, well, we probably won't have grasped what it is that Jesus has achieved and how desperately we need what Jesus offers. If we're speaking against Jesus' unique salvation, then maybe we won't have trusted his death alone for our salvation. And Peter was doing that at this point in this chapter. But as we thought last week, that wasn't the end of Peter's story. Because of the cross, there is always a way back for anyone who will turn back to Christ. While anybody is still here on earth, it's never too late to turn or to return to Jesus, to deny self, take up your cross, and follow Jesus. The Bible convinces me that just one day in eternity, with the rest of eternity ahead of me, will be just so worth it. And then I will fully understand that any cost of following Jesus now will have been worth it. See, let's remember that as we begin a new term living for Christ, living for him, but with the day when we are with him, never far from our minds. As we thought right at the beginning of the service, maybe things are new for us. Maybe there's things that have changed in the last few months. But what it is to follow Jesus and live with him as King has not changed. May we seek him and ask him to empower us to be able to do that. Yes, for now, but also so that we will spend eternity with him. Let's rejoice in our great and wonderful King Jesus.